Well, when I started this lesson, we're doing the miracles of raising from the dead. That wasn't me, I don't think. Anyway, that's okay. You know, we've learned about the miracles of Christ all our lives, you know, and from the time we were tiny with the parting of the Red Sea or Noah's Ark or all the way through the New Testament of feeding and healing. And when I started this lesson, I kind of did a self-evaluation, and I think I realized I've kind of become complacent when it comes to those miracles. And I just kind of take it for granted that, you know, he parted the Red Sea. I've heard that before. I mean, and I did not realize, I don't think I did at the time when I was 4 and thought that was amazing, how amazing it is still today. I have a prayer request for y'all. Well, actually, when Lloyd was reading my lesson, he said that sometimes I treat the miracles like his baseball stories. I've heard them so many times. I'm like, I know, you hit the home run in 9th grade. But anyway, so I said, all right, I'm going to tell him that.
You really can't blame her, though, because he tells them a lot.
A lot. And now we had our gallbladder out, so I'm like, stop. Nobody wants to know that. Anyway, my prayer request for y'all is that you would pray for me to not be complacent with my faith. To be like Kara, who just shouts it to the world every day. And to all of y'all who, behind the scenes, mentor and heal and comfort so many things. I've said it before, and I will say it till I'm not here anymore, that y'all are the backbone of this church. So they can say what they want, and it's y'all. So, but if you would remember to pray for me. And I want to thank Becky and Jill. I forgot your name. How good is that? This may be really interesting for choosing this topic, because I think it's good for us to refresh. And though we didn't study the miracles in the Old Testament, they still were miracles, and how blessed we are to have that. Okay, so let's go. We're going to talk about raising the dead. I know that's it's a hard miracle to hear, because all of us have lost someone that we know could have been raised if that was God's will. And it's hard and honestly, that's the concept that I came into this class with, is if he wanted to raise my dad, my little stillborn baby, whatever, he could have, but he chose not to. And I have to be okay with that. But after I studied this lesson, I realized these miracles have a different purpose. And I was looking at through human eyes and not through God's eyes, which I can only get a glimpse of that here and there. But it is hard when we lose someone and we pray and pray and pray, and the answer's not necessarily no. And then I was reminded by one of my grandchildren that said, why? Why? Because he said where they're going is so much better than here. And I was like, that's true. We cling to this life with our fingernails, when as Christians, we know, well, we can't even imagine what's ahead of us. So anyway, that's how my perspective changed, and I'm going to share a little bit of that with y'all. We're going to start with the widow of, and I'm not good with biblical names or any other names, but I'm going to call it Nain. I don't know if that's right or not, but today it is. It's N-A-I-N. And Luke gives us the only account of this miracle. It's in Luke 7:11 through 15, and I'm going to read that. And Jesus had just healed the centurion's servant, And he, soon after, went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd followed him, as always. And as he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out. The only son of his mother. She was a widow, and a large part of the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. And he said, "Don't cry." And we're not told if she knew who Jesus was. But if she didn't, and a stranger came up to you with a large crowd and said, "Don't cry," you'd be like, "Seriously? This is my only son, and my husband is dead, and I'm gonna cry." And but he told her, "Don't cry." And I just can't help but think his voice must have just been like no other voice, and there was no doubt that something in his voice in itself was calming and reassuring. And then he went up to the briar that they were carrying him on, and the pallbearer stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And he got up, and he began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. It doesn't say he was like, or drowsy, or, what happened, or he immediately was healed from death and whatever killed him. And he got up and went with his mother. When Jesus saw this mom, he had compassion on her. He knew how vividly she remembered her son's baby days, those little chubby cheeks, both sides. Those baby giggles. I was telling Annette in the office, Molly, if you've not heard Molly Mendez giggle, you need to tickle her. She has the best laugh. I wish it was my ringtone. It is the cutest thing, but this son had that as well. To wiping skin knees, helping whenever that first girl breaks his heart. She had gone through all those things and had high hopes as he grew. And Jesus knew all that, and he knew she was her only son and that she was a widow. And that, as we've learned before, left no economical support for her. I mean, she was, destitute because of this. But even with that large crowd pressing against Jesus and her, and I'm sure him, after they saw that, before the healing, she still was brokenhearted in that huge crowd, like we all are when death hits us. But Jesus, like I said, he wasn't a remote or a mere spectator, simply, observing human affairs. He cares for us, and I know y'all all know that. And as I said before, he had compassion on her. And he said, "Do not weep." And then when he touched the briar and had the pallbearer sit down, and with one simple gesture, one simple phrase, he brought that frenzied mob to a quiet stop. He didn't touch the body. He didn't take his hand. He just said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And immediately he got up and began to speak. It's not that he was just brought to life. He was completely healed. And that at that point, he presented her, like I said, alive and well. I can't even imagine that. And the story goes on in verse 16 and 17 where it says, "They were all filled with awe and praised God. A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." The news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. I don't know the timeline, because I'm not a Bible scholar. Wish I was, but the next verse, the very next verse, begins the story of Jesus and John the Baptist. So, personally, I wanted to stay a while and feel that joy and that relief of this widow. I know there's a lot that's not in the Bible, but I just had to sit and listen to those verses one more time and just think about her and the joy that she received. But we'll move on. And the next miracle we're going to look at is the raising of Jairus' daughter. It's the only miracle of raising the dead that's recorded in more than one gospel. It appears in Matthew 9, Mark 5, and Luke 8. And today we're going to stay in Luke. I like staying in Luke because he was a doctor. So, and once again, Jesus had just cast the demons into the pigs. And Jairus was a member of the Capernaum synagogue. And they usually had a board of 7 members. And he knew who Jesus was because Jesus had participated in their services. But he had a great need. His 12-year-old daughter, his only child, was dying. In fact, she would die before Jesus could get there. So Jairus was anxiously waiting for Jesus to return to Capernaum from his healing of the demonic person from the other side of the lake. So can't you just see him pacing back and forth in front of that lake on the shore, desperately looking for that boat that he knew held the only hope for his daughter. And when Jesus got there, he ran to him. It says he approached him, but I can't imagine it was strolling. And he said, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." You know, with the synagogues at this point were closing their doors to Jesus. It was when they were beginning to conspire against him, to stop him any way they could. So it's significant that Jairus swallowed his pride and came begging. I don't think that's as hard. With a daughter that's fixing to die, you grasp at any straw you can get. But I think it's interesting that Jesus, he didn't say, "Oh, really? I think you locked the doors on me last week, so, you know, you're out of luck." Which might have been my response. Even if I did go, I would have to get that little dig in. My family knows. I try not to do it, but somewhere that mom and me just wants to point out that I said. Anyway, but Jesus, obviously, and that's the reason he's our Savior and not me, he said, "Why come to me in trouble?" Well, that was what I said. So anyway, now, poor Jairus, he has a seesaw in his story. His seesaw goes up because he was reassured when Jesus turned and began walking with him toward his home. But then his seesaw went down because a woman with an issue of blood touched the hem of Jesus' garment. And I'm not sure I realized that's where Jesus was going when that story happened. And we all know because Calvet taught a beautiful lesson on that. But Jesus stopped. And that took time, precious time. The lady was healed, but it still took time. He must have thought, "Are we ever going to get to my house?" But when the woman was healed, Jesus started again, and the seesaw went back up. Then the tragic news in the seesaw, I mean, it just, you know, when you were on a seesaw and they pushed you down and you went bouncing, that's what happened. Because someone came up to him and said, "Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." And Jairus' face sagged. And Jesus said, "Don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed." And his faith soared. And then it went way up, because Jesus arrived at his house. And when they got there, they found it in turmoil. Weeping of relatives. Me and this lady are not getting along. Weeping of relatives, which I understand. I don't get the professional mourners. But that's just weird to me. I guess just a cultural thing. You know, the more mourners, the better. Anyway, they were there. But Jesus rebuked the mourners. And he said, "Stop wailing. She's not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him. After all, he hadn't seen the girl. He just walked up. And here he was making this claim when those close to her knew her to be dead. And in Leslie Flynn's book that they gave us, which is awesome, by the way, and I put a copy in the library because we had an extra one, and it's a really good read. She states that Jesus wasn't denying that she was dead, and he wasn't teaching that death should be sleep. He was speaking figuratively to indicate that this girl's death was like sleep because it wasn't permanent. But in the end, she would be awakening. So he ordered those mourners out, and he let only Peter, James, John, and her parents enter the room with him where the child lay. He wanted witnesses to know what he was about to do. He was and then he took the lifeless child by the hand, and he said, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately her spirit returned. Again, no drowsiness, no weakness, physical or mental, no confusion. She simply rose up and walked. And then she wanted something to eat. So, good for a 12-year-old. And Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Then he ordered the astonished parents and 3 disciples not to tell anyone. But who could keep such an astounding miracle? Well, how could you even explain it? You paid these people to come be mourners, and now she's outside playing. But he told them not to. But of course, the news spread like wildfire. Wildfire. You know, it's the old saying where someone tells you not to say something, and you say, "Don't worry, everyone I tell won't tell." So, but they did. And that brings us to Lazarus. At the time of this miracle, Jesus and his disciples were temporarily beyond Jordan because of serious threats back in Judea, and they received word that of an emergency in Bethany. This is John 11, 1-44. And the sisters Mary and Martha sent a message that their brother Lazarus was seriously ill. And Jesus loved Lazarus and the sisters, and they thought Jesus would come immediately and heal their brother. But he waited 2 more days. He continued his work far from the worried sisters, who I'm sure took turns taking care of Lazarus and looking out that road to see if he was coming. And to their bewilderment, he didn't come. Lazarus became worse and worse and died. And then, in the meantime, Jesus told his disciples, Lazarus is dead, and they should then go to him. The disciples didn't understand returning to where the Jews were trying to kill him because Lazarus is already dead. However, they believed in Jesus. We all know how brave and courageous they were. And so they trusted, and they said, okay, we'll go back, even if it meant dying. So on his arrival, Jesus found Lazarus had been dead 4 days. His body was beginning to decompose. The ritual of mourning had already peaked, and Martha, hearing that Jesus was near, hurried out to meet him. And her first words reflected a classic response to a hopeless situation. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Scripture doesn't say, but I think those were pretty stern words. I don't think it was, Lord, if you'd been here, you wouldn't. I think it was like, if you had been here, this would not have happened. Almost to the point that it's your fault. And obviously she was caught up in grief, and somebody always gets the point of that grief, whoever. And he said, your brother will rise again. And she said, I know he will in the resurrection, but he's dead now. And if you'd been here, I'm paraphrasing, he wouldn't be dead. But Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in my will never die. Do you believe this? She must have thought for a minute and then said, yes, Lord. I believe that you're the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. And after she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary. The teacher's here, she said, and he's asking for you. And when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to Jesus. And when she reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. I think this shows the difference in their personalities. Mary fell at his feet, Martha a little bit sterner like me. But anyway, he was deeply moved, and he asked, where have you laid him? And she said, come and see, Lord. And then Jesus wept. Down those holy cheeks rolled tears and genuine sorrow over the loss of his friend, and genuine sympathy for Mary and Martha over the loss of their brother. And even though Jesus knew what was to come, he felt the same pain at that moment that they feel, that we feel after a loss. And it was overwhelming, and he wept. But once he was under control, he came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance, and he said, take away the stone. But Lord, said Martha, by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days. And Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he said this, he called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face, like in mummies on movies. And Jesus said to him, take off those grave clothes and let him go. Can you imagine the awe, the joy, and the praise, the amazement that this man who had been dead 4 days came out perfect, perfectly healed, perfect. I'm not sure we can, but we can try and believe. So when I started today, I told you my perception of these 3 miracles changed after studying. Before, I looked at these miracles like all the other miracles. They're amazing, awe-inspiring. They forever change the lives of the recipients. But I know these miracles were for the glory of God. Just as the son, the widow's son, Jairus' daughter, and Lazarus, they all needed physical life restored. Every member of the human race needs spiritual life. And that's why Jesus came to earth. Jairus' daughter was 12 years old. The widow's son was a youth, probably in his late teens or early 20s. And Lazarus was a mature man in the prime of life. All of them, though, even though they were raised, would die. They would physically die again. And that's what changed my perspective. I don't know if I thought they lived forever because he raised them from the dead, but that's what hit me about this lesson. He raised them to show the glory of God, but they did eventually die. He was raised and did not die. And that's the happy ending of the story. These miracles, they were a sign of God's power, that he can achieve anything. They show us that Jesus had authority to defeat death even before he was crucified and could offer spiritual resurrection. And they confirm to all these people and to us the truth of his message and that his identity is the Messiah. They show us compassion, and when we do need to feel that, no more than when a death occurs for us. These stories all had happy endings, and ours do too. Just as Jesus said to Martha and Mary, "I'm the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." So, as Laura would say, are you ready? And do you believe? Thank you.